Hi again, everyone. I'm Ollie Matthews. This is the Narcissistic Resistance, and this resistance video is sponsored by contribution from Treasure Travel, and here's her story. When my daughter was 5 years old, I got a demanding call from my mom out of the blue. I say out of the blue because, as I have mentioned many times, the phone only worked one way with my parents because it was beneath them to make efforts in our relationship. Actually, this phone call was way out of the blue because my parents had been shunning me for 2 months. As I mentioned in my last letter, long stretches of silent treatment were a childish tactic my parents evolved to try to shame me as an adult for unspecified offenses. Obviously, narcissist parents can send their adult children to their room, so they evolve new tactics to desperately try to shame and maintain control. My mother got right to the point. She said that she and Dad wanted to visit with their granddaughter, but because they did not want to see me, I needed to book my child a solo flight, and they would pick her up at the airport. You fucking cunt. Fuck off. God. What's theirs? Their child. That's the narcissist, man. That's their entitlement. Nothing is yours. Not you, not your body, not your thoughts, not your children. It's theirs. Mine, 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 mine. That's their mentality about you and your life and your things. Mine, mine, mine. My mom's tone was unfriendly, and she did not call to discuss her idea, but simply to dictate to me how it was going to be and what I needed to do. I'm really not sure if my parents actually believed that they wanted to spend time with their granddaughter, or if this was just a power play and an attempt to shame me by emphasizing they had no interest in seeing me. I told my mom I did not feel comfortable putting my 5-year-old on a flight alone and would never do so. My mom scoffed, which was one of her signature expressions, which was literally a guttural noise of dissatisfaction, somewhere between a throat clearing and a pirate's R. My mom said that I was an overprotective mother, and my fear of putting my daughter on a plane was ridiculous. And she said, quote, "It isn't as if we are not going to pick her up at the airport." The conversation ended with Joanne very angrily because I would not back down and sacrifice my child. Being accused of being overprotective of my children was a relentless insult I heard from both my parents. Interestingly, growing up, my sister and I were told that all our little friends were spoiled. In hindsight, I now have a full understanding that my little friends had normal parents and they were nurtured, not spoiled. I hate that fucking word. So when I use it on somebody, because that was used on me, you spoiled brat, spoiled. I didn't even know what the fuck it meant as a kid. This is spoiled? This is spoiled? Like, don't look at your friends because they're more spoiled than you are, because you're spoiled. That was both my mother and my father. Nurturing came naturally to me and Greg, and that irritated the shit out of my parents. Once my dad said to me, and I quote, "Didn't in your last story," and I'm sorry if I screwing this up, if I'm crossing my stories up, wasn't there an argument because you could have gone down on a plane to Hawaii with Greg's in-laws? Wasn't that something? And she wants you to put your 5-year-old on a plane. If I'm crossing up your story with someone else, I apologize, but that's fucking mind-blowing. Once my dad said to me, and I quote, you worry too much about your kids. You need to think about yourself. Kids will always disappoint, so parents need to think first about themselves." This remark was revealing and insulting. Aside from the fact that I would never put a 5-year-old on a flight alone, I had learned the hard way never to leave my children in my parents' care. Neither of my parents are fond of children, although they can tolerate a grandchild for a few hours. They are not nurturing because they are both impatient, selfish, and irritable as hell. To be fair, my father was very good with Aaron. My mother was horrendous. Horrendous. Of course, my father's only motivation of being nice to my daughter was to fuck me over, but subject for another video. And although my mother likes newborn babies, neither one of them is sensitive to the needs of a child. They interpret normal, age-appropriate child behavior as insubordination. Recall the example of my father being proud of himself for hurting a baby with an ice cube outlined in Ollie's video, The Narcissist Doesn't Understand What Emotion Is. Having endured a childhood with them, who knew better than me? Additionally, my parents spent an inordinate amount of time bickering with each other and just being negative in general, and that frightened my children when young. Both of my children, when teens, actually expressed to me and Greg that they found that my parents' negativity was extreme, and that the contrast between my parents and Greg's loving engagement parents were extraordinary. Not to downplay all the emotional toxicity associated with interacting with my parents. My main concern when my children were young was their physical safety when around Joe and Joanne. Although I originally thought that my parenting was just another generic angle from which my parents exploited opportunity to criticize, now that I have studied narcissism, I have a much better understanding of the actual nuances of the psychology. Narcissists hate happy people, and I believe that fact was the main impetus for their relentless criticism. When I had my first child, I was the happiest I had ever been in my life. My narcissist mom and dad hated that and always tried to negatively steer me toward dissatisfaction and doubt by relentlessly challenging my parental, career, and financial decisions. The second thing at play here was the pathological envy, and especially the envy that the NPD mother has for a daughter. The resentment of other people's happiness and satisfaction in life is obviously a manifestation of the pathological envy, but I am listing these behaviors as distinct NPT characteristics for clarity. My mom was envious that I had married a very nice man, whereas she had married Joe, and she hated the fact that my husband and I were so content and over the moon to have a baby. Whereas Joe was disgusted by pregnancy and her weight and jealous of her caring for the offspring. Greg was devoted and loving husband and father who delighted in his children. Joanne said in a sing-song tone right after we had our first baby, "You and Greg are just going to have a great time playing house, aren't you?" That's a quote. Here's another Joanne quote said during a visit when my daughter was 4 months old, and it is a classic narcissistic veiled dig. "Aren't you going to straighten up the house at least a bit before your husband gets home from work?" Well, I guess if I had a cute, sweet little baby like her, then I would just have held her all day long and not gotten anything done either. Both my parents got in venomous digs in every conversation, suggesting that I was lazy and needed to wean the baby and get back to work. "You need to get her potty trained and in daycare so you can get back to work." Yeah, you know what? And my mother tried that with Erin. "You got to get her potty trained. And you know what happened? That kid shit in her pants until she was 4 years old. She refused. She refused it. It's just misery. I found myself constantly defending the decision that Greg and I made for me to be an at-home mom while our children were young. We never asked my parents for any money or complained to them, and it was none of their damn business, but they took every opportunity to try to shame me for taking care of my kids. As I mentioned in a previous letter, my dad said in a disgusted voice, "She's pregnant again," when we had called to share our happy news that we were expecting our second child. I was 31 years old, and Greg and I were 5 years married, and financially stable homeowners. Yet he was disgusted by my pregnancy and wanted to make sure, damn sure, I knew it. The third phenomenon at play, driving their relentless criticism of my parenting, was that, true to all narcissists, my parents despised anything they did not understand. Parental concern for the emotional and physical well-being of children was beyond their comprehension. When their own grandchildren came along, they got for the first time in their lives the full behind-the-scenes look at real parental love and nurturing, and it baffled them. They constantly insinuated and also flat out told me that my children were spoiled, and behind my back they told my sister that we were raising brats. Immediately after my first child was born, my mom made a point in every conversation to contradict everything I did that was safe. For example, pediatricians strongly caution parents not to lay their babies on their tummies because of the very significant statistical correlation with sudden infant death syndrome. My mother did the same thing. She kept trying to put Erin on her stomach. In addition to the large body of convincing data, the hypothesis at face value just made sense to anyone with half a brain. If a tiny newborn is deep in sleep and his nose and mouth are smushed into the mattress, he might not wake up to turn his head and breathe because of the underdeveloped neural motor skills. My mom said that was ridiculous, and I found myself defending the data in many conversations. Prior to my realization that my kids were not safe with my mother, I had left my newborn daughter with her for 1 hour. When Greg and I returned, we found my mom passed out snoring on the twin bed with our baby on her arm, dangerously close to the gap between the mattress and the wall. My mom had failed to place the baby safely in the crib before passing out. I'm sure that all of us have accidentally done that, but the problem with the narcissist doing it is that they don't take responsibility for making mistakes, and so they don't learn, but instead repeat their mistakes. They'll double down on it. They will double down, they will triple down, they don't give a shit. I did not know the term narcissist back then, but I knew my mom well enough to understand that it was futile for me to try to explain to her that it was unsafe to fall asleep with the baby, so I just understood that I could not trust her. You see, my mom does not just doze off, but rather passes out, and I doubt she would have awoken if she rolled over and the baby fell to the floor. Or worse, wedged and smothered against the wall. Basically, I knew that my mom would always do the opposite of whatever I wanted anyway, just to spite me, whether my child was an infant or 5 years old. Here is a quote from my mom that sums her up. Nurturing philosophy on potty training. That sums up her nurturing philosophy on potty training. You will never get her potty trained if you jump up to change her. She needs to sit and poop so she learns. My baby was less than a year old when my mom barked out that advice. I ignored her. This comment revealed that my mother viewed her own infants as insubordinate for soiling their own diapers and neglected us just as she was constantly advising me to do with my babies. Many times she told me that I needed to let my babies cry in their cribs for hours so they would learn to be quiet. I ignored her. It annoyed her that I disregarded her parenting advice, and my dad castigated me, yelling, "Don't even take her advice. You don't even take her advice." My husband and I visited my parents in their state when our daughter was about a year old. After we got back home, I broke out in a horrible rash on my neck and chest. I assumed it was shingles and immediately went to a dermatologist. The dermatologist told me I had poison oak. I had told her that I had not been in the wilderness or even on a walk in the neighborhood recently, so how could that be? She asked where I had been the week prior and said that is where I came in contact with the poison. I was driving back from my appointment and suddenly realized to my horror how I got poison oak. My mother had taken my daughter for a short stroller walk just around the block and came back with my baby carrying a bright red bouquet of branches. I realized that must have been the poison oak, which turns deep red in the fall, and then my baby had gotten the Urshal all over my chest when I nursed her. It was actually poison sumac, which looks different than poison oak or ivy, which is why my husband and I failed to identify the plant as dangerous. I was terrified because my baby's face had been exposed. I immediately called the dermatologist to ask about my daughter and said that because it was probably at first exposure for her, she said that because it was probably a first exposure for her, she might not get a rash, but if I noticed anything, I needed to bring her in immediately because it would be an emergency. I next called my mother and told her that I just realized 4 days after the fact that the red bouquet was poison sumac, and so she should remove it from her dining room table ASAP. My mom nonchalantly told me she already knew because she had gotten a rash 3 days ago and she didn't call. Dude, I would have flown back out there to fucking drop kick her. I'd have fucking drop kicked her. She got in a rash 3 days ago, so she had already disposed of the branches. My jaw dropped and I said, "You knew 3 days ago that it was poisonous and yet you didn't bother to call me?" This was one of those epiphanies for me when I saw my ugly, selfish mom behind her mask. We all had screwed up and not realizing the branches were poison sumac, but that was not the point. When my mom realized that it was poisonous and she got it out of her house to protect herself, she should have rushed to the phone to warn us. This is what you need to understand here, Treasure Travel. Remember, the phone only works one way. Why? Because you're not even in her fucking thoughts. She didn't even think to call you. She didn't even remember. She has to be probably reminded of you of something in order for you to even come across her fucking mind. It's why you go months without hearing from her. It's why the phone only works one way. Because unless she's reminded of you by something or someone else, you're not even in her thoughts. That's why the phone only works one way. But the narcissist can never admit guilt, so she had no intention to give me a warning. You weren't even in her thought. It's not guilt. You weren't there. The phone only works one way for a reason. Because they don't even think about you unless they're reminded. It's like, oh yeah, where is she? Let's call her up and break her balls. How long has it been? Who knows? Oh yeah, remember that? We have a daughter too. Yeah, we have that other daughter. Yeah. I'm telling you, that's how it is. Hell, my daughter could have experienced delayed hypersensitivity reaction in the middle of the night in her crib and her trachea could have swelled, and the medical examiner's report would have read crib death. I assumed that my mom was just hoping that if the baby got a serious rash that I would not put two and two together and realize it was the red bouquet. She didn't even think about it. See, you're thinking, that's how bad this is. So you're thinking she's just trying to cover her trash. She was afraid to tell you and hoping. It's worse. Because once you're out of sight, out of mind, she didn't even think, If she gave one shit about you, were like, oh my God, who else? Nope. She'd have known immediately where it came from. She would have known the baby was there. Where did this come? No. Phone only works one way for a reason. My mother not having the decency to give me a heads up for that, for the sake of trying to help my baby, was inexcusable. The fact that you wasn't even in the thought is what's inexcusable. Fast forward to a subsequent visit to my parents' house when my daughter was 2 and I was 6 months pregnant. My parents lived in a beautiful development that was adjacent to a state park with trails starting right across the street, and we all went on a hike. My mom led the way to a wide meadow, and despite my protests, insisted that we cross this meadow and intercept another trail. My 2-year-old was walking, so I had assumed that she was leading us on a short, safe hike. I told my mom that my 2-year-old cannot walk through this tall grass because of rattlesnakes. My mom scoffed and said they are not out of hibernation yet. I told her that none of us knew exactly when in spring they emerge, and since the weather had been quite warm for weeks and we were deep in May, there was indeed a risk that no level of risk was acceptable for a 2-year-old. In May, she wants to risk it with rattlesnakes in May? Come on. I said, you do realize if she gets bitten by a rattler, she will die because she's only 2. And if I get bitten, I will probably lose the baby. So I picked up my 2-year-old from the thick grass that was chest high for her and waded through. I asked my dad if he would please take her, and my mom barked, "No, Joe, don't carry her. That's ridiculous. She's too heavy. She can walk." And to my astonishment, my dad obeyed Lady Macbeth. I struggled carrying my daughter, and finally my dad realized that I would not put her down and that he should help me, so he did reach out and took her despite my mom's protests, and we continued. In a previous letter, specifically about my dad in honor of Father's Day, I did say that despite the fact that he's an overt narcissist, he does have a bit of compassion and is very intelligent. If it wasn't compassion in that moment, then at least it was smart enough to understand how ridiculous it was to let the pregnant lady struggle to carry the 2-year-old, and probably he worried that a neighbor might see this spectacle. Fast forward to when my daughter was 2.5 and my mother flew out for the birth of my second child. I have written about that last visit from hell in a previous letter called Jakey, Ollie's video called The Narcissist Likes to Create Chaos Before a Visit. On that trip, I had asked that my mother please keep her purse up high as it contained prescription over-the-counter drugs, and my daughter was fascinated by purses and would get into it if left at her level. Of course, my mom did the opposite, and my mother got the drugs out, but luckily it was only out of sight for a few minutes and had not yet opened the packaging. In that case, as in the case of the poison sumac, my mom was unapologetic and took no responsibility, but instead twisted the narrative and accused me of being the irresponsible one, and in the same breath, too overprotective. Love the irony of that. As said above, we all make mistakes, and kids can get hurt even with the most caring parents, but it is so much more dangerous when a narcissist adult refuses to take responsibility to learn from their mistakes. Because if your children or you are not in her direct sight, she forgets you exist. Even if she's at your house, she forgets you all exist. That's why the phone only works one way. My dad confessed to my sister prior to one of my next visits that he had no idea what to do with the grandkids. My sister offered a simple suggestion that he organize a couple of kid-friendly activities for the family. As smart as he is, that had not occurred to him. To give him credit, he took advice and organized 2 excursions for the kids. But a week after we left, he admitted to my sister that he was tired, tried telling her that my 5-year-old son was constantly demanding attention, and that even after doing the activities, my kids still wanted attention. Oh gee, kids want attention. To clarify, my kids were never left in their care, and I was always present, so I know my kids behaved well. My son liked my dad and did want to interact with him, but my dad interpreted that behavior as spoiled and demanding rather than warm and friendly. My dad thinks that kids need to be perfectly silent unless he wants them to speak, and if they are not, then they are misbehaving. He has no understanding or tolerance for normal kid behavior. Despite my dad's high IQ and living for 82 years on this planet, the obvious has eluded him. If you want people to like you, then you have to be likable. And if you want your family to spend time with you, then you have to stop being so goddamn fucking mean. The reason why I can remember the past in detail and exact quotes from my parents is because their behavior was so bizarre and mean that it scared me very deeply, and so the memories are vivid as they happened yesterday. I am grateful I was able to recall the details, because otherwise I might still be trying at age 54 to please my cruel parents. The best therapy for this has been to write it all down and have you read it publicly. You have to get it out, otherwise it festers in your subconscious and eats you alive. So thank you, Ollie, for the bottom of my heart, for your channel and being willing to bare your soul about the abuse you suffered, and for the insight and validation, your raw honesty. My anxiety level regarding this shit, and just my anxiety level in general, has dropped precipitously, such that I am a completely different person. Treasure 2.0. The new Treasure accepts things and rolls better with the punches of life. Being able to get validation on your channel also gave me the courage to go full no contact with my parents, and that has improved my life exponentially. You can't make this shit up. Treasure travel. Oh, thank you again, Treasure. I really do appreciate it. Understand why the phone only works one way. They want you, your father wants you out of sight, out of mind. Wants you quiet unless he wants to talk to you. Your father wants to be able to do what your mother does. Just forget everybody fucking exists. That's the problem with your mother. She's such a narcissist, and she's such a sociopath, and she cares so little about you and your children. Unless you're directly in front of her, she never even thinks about you unless reminded. So, hope that helps. Thank you again for another contribution and story. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody watching. Please leave any opinions or advice in the comments section below. And if you want your story read on the channel, you have a topic you'd like me to cover, a narcissist you'd like to expose, or you'd like to sponsor a video like this for someone who needs help and can't afford it, or just make a contribution to the channel in general to keep it supported, growing, and successful, because this channel survives 100% on contributions from all of you. Without you guys, all this goes away. So if you like what you see here and you want to see more videos like this, you know what to do with the PayPal and email links in the description box. Also, please like and share this video wherever you can. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and be sure to click the subscription bell to be notified of all my video uploads. I'm Ollie Matthews. This has been the Narcissistic Resistance. Take care.